Good morning. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Yerushalmi Kalayim Pei Gimel, Halach Vav, and God willing, we're going to go all the way to the end of the Peidik. We're going to be learning today Daf Lamed Dalid. We left off on Daf Lamed Dalid, Amid Dalid, in the middle of the Amid, right after the Gemara, right 9 lines from the top of the Amid. And let's first review the Mishnah that we had, Halach Vav, and then we're going to go back and quickly review a sugya that we had on Daf Lamed Gimel, because it's interesting how the Gemara today will go back to the topic that we had on Daf Lamed Gimel, as I'll explain in a moment. So we're going to do that, but I'm going to do that after I share the rest of the introduction. After the Gemara is going to go back to Daf Lamed Gimel, we're going to have various inquiries concerning the din of diluyim, of a gourd, and how we will see that these inquiries will be resolved, different inquiries, by using the same rationale, and that will be that we will compare the dinim here of Deluyin with the din of a kerem. True, the din kerem begins on the next chapter. We already started to quote some halachas of kerem, how when you have a single, what's halachically considered a single vine, you have to distance any other plant from it only 6 tfachim. When you have what will be defined as a vineyard, as a kerem, then you have to have a separation, a gap of dalad amas. That's the general, and then the details there will be applied over here. And we're going to see in our daf today how there is a big difference, again, whether when you plant a vegetable, you're planting it for its leaves, versus when you plant a vegetable, even though it's a vegetable, if you're planting it for its seed, then as we will see, specifically regarding how much distance does that vegetable need to have from a field of grain, that intent will make a difference. We'll leave it at that. And now let's quickly chazer, halacha vav, and go back and chazer the sugya that we had on Daf Lamed Gimel. So in halacha vav, we had, like we mentioned at the end of last year, 2 arguments. It's very interesting to point out the seder of the Mishnah. That's not the point right now. But let me organize it this way. The first argument we have in the Mishnah is that what will be the din if you have one gourd that's planted near a field of grain, or planted in a field of grain. What is foundational in our sugya is that we are not speaking about a row of gourd to the right and a row of gourd to the left and other vegetables in between. That was the previous sugya. That is an issue of chavush. That is where we have the demand, whether it's 8 amas, whether it's 12 amas, of a separation between the 2 rows of gourds, for them not to create a scenario of closing in, of chavushing in that which is in middle. That was the previous sugya. Our Mishnah is speaking about stam 2 rows. You have a row, or you have a seed of one vegetable, and you have a gourd. So again, both the Chachamim and Rabbi Yossi hold that from one gourd to a field of grain, you have to have the distance of a base right. That was the beginning of the Mishnah. And I'm going out of the Seder of the Mishnah itself. And then at the Sefer of the Mishnah, we have concerning this din 2 other opinions. In other words, mitzad echad, it's both the Chachamim / Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi. Base Raiva. Then we have Rabbi Meir b'shem Rabbi Yishmael, 8 times that amount. And then we had Rabbi Yossi ben Achoy Tevefrasim in the name of Rabbi Yishmael, 30 times more than the amount of Rabbi Meir. Okay, and that is all regarding one gourd vis-a-vis a field of grain. The second topic of the Mishnah, which is actually recorded first as a machlokes, what happens if you have a row of gourd next to a field of grain? Why would a row of gourd be different? Because the more gourds are planted together, once it's classified as a row, it's automatically more distinct. And the logic will be that the more distinct the row of gourd is as a mitzios for itself, the less it will appear to be mixed in with, kalayim with a neighboring vegetable. And indeed, here's where we have the machlokes. The Chachamim, right, which is the first opinion according to the Mishnah, hold, since it's a row of gourds, you only need to have 6 tvachim. And according to the Tana Rabbi Yossi, you have to have 4 amos. Let's keep this clear in our minds. And now let's go back to the Gemara that we had on Daf Lamed Gimel. What did we have on Daf Lamed Gimel? That when the Gemara quoted, when the Mishnah quoted the three-way machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Akiva, and the Chacham, three-way men, B'negei the din of Chavush, right? 2 rows of gourds, and in between it, you want to have, the example we were using was a row of vegetables. And clearly, the Rabbi Akiva, all you need to have between the space needed between the 2 row of gourds are onions, are 8 amas, 8 amas. And you can pack up those 8 amas with onions. Elamah, you have to have the furrow. Now we're already going back to Halacha Gimel, the Shitas Rabbi Akiva of 6 tfachim. By 6 tfachim, at the ends or on the tops, at the rashim of these rows. Other than that, they can mamash go all the way adjacent one to the other. Question is, how to understand Shitas Rabbi Yishmael. So what we had was a machlekes between what the Yerushalmi calls Kahana, right, who we in the Bavli call it Af Kahana, and Shmuel, Bishitas Rabbi Yishmael. They have to remember this clear. Now, we don't have to quote Kahana now. It's information that's going to be too much. It's not needed now. We're going to quote Shita Shmuel, which is the way we learned the Mishnah before we began the Gemara, that Rabbi Yishmael holds you have to have 12 amas. 8 amas is not enough. On that, the Gemara asked, and according to Shmuel's understanding of Rabbi Yishmael, that Rabbi Yishmael holds you have to have a 12 amma gap between the 2 rows of gourds for that vegetable that's planted in between, not to be considered chavush. What's the nafkamina between Rabbi Yishmael and the Chachamim? That was the Gemara's question, because the Chachamim also clearly say that you have to have 12 amas. It's the same shita. And the Gemara answered on Daf Lamed Gimel, and I'm quoting the words of the Gemara, al date that Rabbi Yishmael asur lismoich. So if you remember in the picture, as we had over here, is that it's not only that you have to have 12 amas. In addition to the necessity of having 12 amas between the 2 row of gourds, no part of the gourds and the onions are allowed to be adjacent one with the other. How much shear did Rabbi Yishmael give, according to Shmuel, in the Mishnah of separation? It's 2 amas. But the emphasis of the Gemara on Daf Lamed Gimel wasn't the quantity of the 2 amas. It was the idea that asur lismoich. You have to have actually a gap between the onions from both sides to the gourds. Masha'enkin, I'm again quoting the words of the Gemara and Daf Lamed Gimel, adata the Rabbanan muter lismoich. And that was a great answer, which was talking about, now, when we said muter lismoich, like we say when we learned Rabbi Akiva, not mamish lismoich from one side to the other. No, that's another din. You have to have the 6 by 6. You have the 6 by 6. But other than resolving that little gap, everything else, according to the Chachamim, is allowed to be together. That was the Gemara's answer. We are beginning today's Shir Ched on Daf Lamed Dalid, Amud Aleph, right? It's mamish in the middle of the Amud by the Gemara. Gemara 9 lines from the top, probably 9 lines from the bottom, mamish in the middle. The Gemara is going to now say, now I'll show you another nafkamina between Rabbi Yishmael and the Chachamim vis-a-vis our Mishnah. Our Mishnah is not speaking about chavush. Our Mishnah is not speaking about a gourd to the right and a gourd to the left and a row of onions in the middle. We're speaking about a row of gourds and a row of onions. That's it. Okay, we're focusing on what Rabbeinu HaKadosh was mesaded towards the reisha of the Mishnah, that 1 gourd by a field of grain, beis roiva. Right, even though we're going to challenge that later in the Mishnah. But we're beginning with that premise. A row, machlokes, the Chachamim and Rabbi Yosi. Right? 6 tvachim or 4 amas. Or 4 amas. No one holds that it has to be a beis roiva. When you put that case of the Mishnah, that will give another response. And let's go right away inside. Okay, Chevra, 9 lines from the top of the Gemara, says Rabbi Yechanan Gabaldik. We had a kash on Daf Lamed Gimel, Shita Shmuel. And evidently, Rabbi Yechanan is siding with Shmuel, not with Kahana L'choira, because the Gemara brought a Braisa that substantiated, that backed up Shita Shmuel. L'choira, that's the conclusion of the Gemara. So, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, I'll tell you something about it. And I'll give you another nafkamin. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, which means Ladas Rabbi Yishmael, even though they both are common that you have to have 12 amas when it's in between. Here we're not talking about in between. But according to Rabbi Yishmael, listen to these words, Chavra, afilu shura yechidis, even when it's not chavush, even when it's only 1 row of gourds, and you want to plant it adjacent to a row of vegetables, the mashal we are giving consistently is a row of onions. you have to have an avoida. Remember the word avoida? The word avoida means an empty space. Wow. Now, how much avoida must you give? That's the Gemara doesn't say here. Here's what we have to look into inside the Noise Kalim. Let us go that the avoida that's needed, have to listen to these words, are 4 amas, but not the way Rabbi Yossi says 4 amas. Rabbi Yossi says a row of gourds and a row of onions, you have to have a gap of 4 amas. No, you have to have on both sides of the row of the gourd, on both sides, you have to have an avoida space. Now let's go with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi says 4 amas, which means 2 amas on either side. This is brilliant. Because what we are really taking from halacha hey is the idea, according to Shmuel, according to Rabbi Yishmael, not only that you have to have an avoida, that the avoida has to be divided half and half. Half on this side, half on that side. Half on this side, half on that's gavaldik. And only then is it considered distinct. However, again, the Gemara is so mekatzed in the Yerushalmi. What the Gemara means to add, but according to the Chachamim, which argue with Rabbi Yishmael, right? They argue with Rabbi Akiva also, but that is easy, right? Instead of 8-12, the Chachamim hold that when you have, in the case of a chavush, you don't need to have any space between the onions and the gourds. Same thing over here. You won't need to have any space. Now, when you say you don't need to have avoid the space, I just want to add, it doesn't mean that your mamish don't need to have any space. That's not possible. What it does mean is that they will hold that you have to have either, let me go, Latanakama 6 tfachim, either Latanakama you'll have to have 6 tfachim. According to Rabbi Yossi, you're going to have 4 amas. But you know what the beauty is? It doesn't have to be divided on each side. That's the pshat over here. I mean, there has to be a separation. But the meaning of the avoida means that on either side you have to have gewaldik. And that will be another nafkamina. And that concludes the link between the Mishnah here, halacha vav, on daf lamed dalid, and that which we learned on daf lamed gimel. The Seder is unique, just to appreciate. In the Bavli, we don't have that. And not only the kitzur. Okay. Now let's go back. Now it's simple, Chavre. If you missed that whole in Hagdama, the first part of the Mishnah, after the Mishnah lays out some of the opinions that between one gourd and a field of grain, you have to have a base raiva. That statement is L'kula Alma. What happens if one gourd, if you have a row of gourds, the Mishnah says that was the machlekes between our Mishnahs, Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi, right? 6 tvachim or 4 ames, says the Gemara. And let's understand this question to be al das Rabbi Yossi, mahu litein avoida l'roshin. Mahu litein avoida l'roshin. So if I can ask for the Gabbai, if you could put up the top picture in the art scroll, and I want you to take a look. Okay, what are we talking about? The picture, for some reason, they made it from right to left. I know why they did it that way. But, don't get confused by the picture. If you have a Gemara Chevra, if you have an art scroll, look inside 34A2. And if not, if you're looking at the Zoom, then look at the picture that the Gabbai is about to put up. And if you have neither, then you do what our Zaytas did. Use your mind more. The top picture, very good. So the row, the 5 little circles, that's the row of gourds. And Rabbi Yossi says that if you want to plant onions on either side, guys, it's not gourds on either side. That's chavush. That's not our Mishnah. You have one row, you have a field of vegetables, and you're planting in the field of onions, you're planting a row of gourds. What's the more chamor opinion in our Mishnah? Planting a row of gourds, 4 amas. Okay. And the 4 amas have to be on either side, right? 4 amas here and 4 amas there. Either side is being separated from the row of onions. Now take a look at what he calls the head, the Russian. Do you need to have 4 amas at the heads as well? That's the question. Or do we say that since you have 4 amas from either side, the Russian only needs l'cha'ira to have 6 tefachim. That's l'cha'ira the Gemara's kash. Okay. Or will Rabbi Yossi argue with the Tanakama that not only do you need to have 4 amas on either side, you also need 4 amas by the heads? Before we go on, I just want to share a question that I had and I don't have an answer to yet. And that is, how can you plant anything at the heads? Does that not create the issue of chavush in the opposite direction? Didn't we learn we're not allowed to surround type B of any vegetable with type A that from all the 4 sides? So I don't know the answer to that. Okay, but coming back to the Gemara, in other words, does Rabbi Yossi only argue by the sides? Will he agree with the Tanakama that by the heads you only need to have 6 tefachim, kishitas Tanakama? Or is he machmer that the 4 amas is a necessity von alle Seiten? And the Gemara says, I'll tell you the answer. And we're going to have this consistently in the next couple of inquiries. That let us compare the din of our Mishnah to the topic beginning with the next chapter of a Kerem. Come on, the Tebegamik Kerem. That there is a difference between a non-yard. If it's only single vines, you have to have 6 tefachim. When you have a Kerem, that's the picture of a Kerem, the bottom picture, the minimum, L'shitas, base hillel, the minimum amount of vines that will make a halachic vineyard is 5, but not only 5, but dafka when they are configured in 2 rows. One option of this configuration will be 3 and 2. And now that you have a kerem, any other plant has to be distanced from the kerem 4 ames. And there also, when it comes to the 4 ames by a kerem, there it's known, it's not only from the sides, but it's from any direction, from the head as well. That come on, that noistel avoida. The avoida means the empty space of 4 ames, even l'rashin, even for the heads, not only from the sides. So since that's a given by the din of a kerem, says the Gemara, ufachi here also noistel avoida l'rashin, which means according to the Tana Rabbi Yossi, the necessity of 4 ames isn't only from the sides; it's also from the heads. Beautiful. Next inquiry, where again we're going to resolve from the din of a kerem. Now look inside the Gabbai, Rabbi Fishman, if you can just show the bottom picture. In the bottom picture again, guys, what's the case of Rabbi Mishnah? You have a field of onions. And in the field of onions, you have in the bottom, that's the row of gourds. And we got it. We have to have a distance, 6 tvachim, 4 ames. The Gemara asking, Ma'u lizraya bein hagumais. Milsa agav urcha kamashbalan. That when they would plant gourds, the way they would plant gourds is that they would make a hole in the ground, right? And they would make a row of holes, and in the holes they would plant the gourds. That's just the meaning of gumais. So gumais here means in the row. What does it mean in the row? What does it mean in the row? That again, the kasha is li Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi Taka demands for there to be a distance between this row and the onions of 4 ames. Maybe Rabbi Yossi only holds you have to have 4 ames by the sides and by the heads. But what happens if a person is planting a individual onion, mamish in the row, that you need to have 6 tvachim as a given? Of course, you can't plant it within 6 tvachim. That's a bona fide kalayim. But in other words, Rabbi Yossi is being machmer. You have to have 4 ames. Maybe if one is planted in the row, maybe, it's amazing the logic of the kasha, you only need to have 6 tvachim, maybe you won't need to have 4 ames. And why would that be? Again, because the row of the gourds looks so distinct. The more distinct the gourds are, the less they will appear to be mixed in with the onions, and the less the onions will appear to be mixed in with the gourds. So the Gemara says, no, we don't have that leniency. And again, we're gonna get the resolution from the din of a kerem. Answers the Gemara. Come on, the temagam kerem. Also, l'zroi ben agfanim. Again, guys, between a geffen yechidi, halachic yechidi, only 6 tvachim is needed. The moment you have a kerem, now you have a kerem 4 ames. By a kerem, by 4 ames, 4 ames is from the sides. 4 ames is from the heads. 4 ames is from the middle. It doesn't matter where. Ufachi asal l'zroi ben agumais. 4 ames is required everywhere. Nikuda. Another inquiry, Rabbi Yoina boy, that not a chamisha diluyin. we're going to see dafka the number 5. You don't have a picture is not needed. If you planted 5 gourds, if that's called a row, but usamachim legader. Now, samachim legader doesn't mean that you planted them near the wall. You planted them near the wall, and when the gourds are growing out from the ground, you are supporting the gourds on the wall. This is important. And that's Amachayim. This is the Seder of Rabbi Yechanan. Let's get a quick Hagdama to one of the foundational halachas that we will be learning, God willing, in the next chapter. And that is like this. Right? We keep on quoting that by a kedem, as defined by Beis Hillel, right? You have to have 2 rows, a row of 3 and a row of 2. It means according to Beis Hillel, if you have 5 vines and they are configured in one single row, they don't have a din of a kedem, they still have a din of a gefen yechidi, which only necessitates the space of 6 tvachim. Okay, that is what we kept on repeating. We repeated this already, I think, 4 times. Now let's add a detail. Let me use the words in English. We're going to see these words in next page. If the vines are straggled means that one did not build a trellis or any type of support system, which is commonly, yes, done today, upon which to lean the vines. It's when they are on the ground, when they are straggled on the ground, dafka 2 rows, 3, 2. If it would be a 1 row of 5, it doesn't have a din of a kedem. Masha'enken, if they're trained, that's the word in English. In other words, they are leaned over some sort of support, which is the way people plan the karamim that whoever went to a kedem here in by Herzog or over there in Italy or Lahavdil, in Chayil Likadusha, whoever went to the Holy Land, if it's trained on support, and that's called an aris, it's more chashuv. And when you have an aris, trellises or trellis, then even if the 5 are on a single row, they have a din of a kedem. L'chumra, you need to have 4 ounces. That's what we are borrowing from the next chapter. Now let's come back to our question. Asks Rabbi Yoina, if you have 1 single row of diloyim, but usmachim legeder means that the way you don't want them to grow out of the ground stem, but you planted them near a fence and you are using the fence like you are using an aris by a kedem, does it create a greater chumrah? Does it create a greater chumrah? And what will be the greater chumrah? That in our Mishnah, the Tanakama argues with Rabbi Yosef. Tanakama holds that you only have to have 6 tvachim, even by a row. Maybe if you lean it on the gader, maybe the Chachamim will agree with Rabbi Yosef. You need to have daled ames. That's the Gemara's question, and the Gemara doesn't answer that question. Unresolved question. It's difficult for me to understand fully this question. I'll just say the words that people are probably thinking, and that is, I don't understand. The more distinct a kedem is, the more chamur we become. Oh, a kedem has to have daled ames. The more distinct the gourd is, the less it appears mingled with chayim. So just like if you have a single gourd, beis roiva, you need a lot of space. The moment it's a row, you need to have less space. Even according to Rabbi Yossi, less space, only 4 amos, not a beis roiva. So if it's leaned on the gader, it should need less space. That would be das balabatim, right? But the Gemara is going in the opposite direction. The Gemara is saying that maybe if it's leaned on a wall, then the Chachamim should be machmer like Rabbi Yossi, and this question is unresolved. And let's move on by Daf Lamed Dalid Amid Beis. Says the Gemara that this general halach of the Mishnah, that a gourd, the luyin, is not like other vegetables. Ooh, we're more machmer, right? A single gourd, a beis roiva, or a lot more. The Gemara wants to know what type of gourds is the Mishnah referring to. Gourd stam is the last Yavanis. If Kevin would have been here, he would have found the picture on Google, whether it's correct or not, of the Greek gourd. But there are other gourds. You have the Egyptian gourd. So the Gemara wants to know, Mahu. These are the opening, our gear. So the opening question on Daf Lamed Daled Amid Beis is that what is the rule, on what case is the ruling of our Mishnah applicable upon? Is it B'chol HaDeloyim Misharim? Deloyim means all Deloyim, or not, Not meaning maybe our Mishnah look inside the top Marafulda, me name it the Dafka with the last Yevanis might have a loy mitzvahs, or Yafilu mitzvahs. Answers the Gemara. Kol Makim Shosiso Kishus Pula Mitzvah Kedulas Yevanis. Whenever I'll give you an example. We'll read in the Marafulda in a moment from the previous chapter. Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis. Whenever we're learning a din in which Rabbeinu Hakadosh or the halacha equates the laws together with the kishus, as we are teaching kishus, a shaped melon, and equating the deloyin with a pula mitzvah. Whenever that's the case, then you're right. Then it's a more inclusive din, and that will also include the Egyptian delas, not only the Greek delas. At oisa delas mitzvahs kedelas yevanis. However, Vikan in our Mishnah dafka gourd shelo yosiso kishus upula mitzvah kedelas yevanis. It's a more limited chumrah, so therefore we will also limit it more only to the last Yevanis and not to the last mitzvahs. What will be an example of where we learned recently that the din of the dalas is like the kishus and the pula mitzvah? So look inside Chavre, the second line from the top in the Marafulda. Umeshane kol makom shosisa kol makom shatam adami kishun and pula mitzvah das Yevanis. Even though that we know that the Egyptian gourd doesn't extend itself as much as the Greek one, over here in our Mishnah, so what example does he give? The example that he gives, if you remember, the Mishnah gave a general rule that when people planted whatever the two species were and they followed the halacha that the Chachamim gave us by giving the proper separation space needed. What happens if afterwards those plants extended themselves and they grew one into the other, or into the space, or one into the other? So we had a machlokes in the Mishnah, and the Mishnah quoted the Rabbi, which some people have as a girsa, Rabbi Meir, which is the girsa that he's bringing right now in the Marafulda, that all other plants, since you planted them kedin, you can leave them even once they start to get krichen to the other. However, there's an exception. Now, what is the exception at the end? The dalas, the pula mitzri, gavaldik, and the kishuin. And therefore, over there, the dalas won't only mean yavanas, it's going to mean mitzvahs as well. Because whenever the Mishnah equates these three dinim together, then we include also all types of gourds. Masha Enken in our Mishnah. So the whole halach of Vav is dafka when it comes to the last yavanas. Beautiful. Moving on in the Mishnah, right? So again, we're still up to the case of a row. And regarding a row, the Chachamim go back leniently to the sixth tvachim. Rabbi Yossi holds that no, that you have to give 4 ames. Okay, but even according to Rabbi Yossi, you don't need to have a base roiva. You don't need to have a base roiva. So the Gemara is going to ask over here, the Yisivne, why wouldn't the Chachamim challenge Rabbi Yossi by asking, when a person will plant stalks, but the kavana is for their seeds, or even if you did not plant them lechatchila for their seeds, but now that the leaves are ready, if the owner chooses to leave them in the ground, he's being mekayim the moist stalks of vegetables which are edible dafka now. When you want to eat the stalks, you want them to be softer and not harder. You would harvest them now. You say, no, I want them for their seed. And even though you want to keep them longer, whether it's a row, whether it's yechidim, right? Tzarech lahafnis lahem beis roiva. Or lasois mechitza gavoya asara tvachim, which is amazing. In other words, when we said that when it comes to other vegetables, you only need to have the 6 tvachim. The moment the intent is for seeds, then those vegetables have to be separated with the distance of a beis roiva from a field of grain. This is important. Whether it's a row, whether it's an individual, we make no difference. So, kal hu b'shura. Over here, individual stalks need to have a base raiva. So why will the Chachamim be more lenient when it comes to a shura that you only have to have 6 tvachim? 1 second. No, forget the Chachamim should bring a raya from the din of leaving kolachim lizera, that a row should be more lenient. Why is that again? Because mekayim kolachim lachem lizera. I got it. When do you say that since you want to leave them lizera, you have to have a base raiva? Fakir, the din is only if it's individuals. Only if it's either a base raiva or you have to mechitza high 10 tvachim. But kalu b'shura. But if you're planting a row of vegetables and you are leaving them for their seed, since it's a row by other vegetables, you don't need to have a base raiva. So we find a precedent from other vegetables, lizera, that we are more lenient when it comes to a row vis-a-vis an individual. So that is l'chayda akash against Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is not allowing you to have the heter of only 6 tvachim even by a row. So why didn't the Chachamim ask that to Rabbi Yossi? Answers the Gemara, Mima, the law must have law. Havikein. Since the sages did not challenge Rabbi Yossi, because they knew they can. Because the premise of the kasha is something in which they knew Rabbi Yossi disagrees with. That Rabbi Yossi Savar Meimar, he shura himeruba gavaldik. Just like by Yechidim, Lukula Alma, if you are Mekayim Kalachim Lachem, Lizera, you have to have a base raiva. The same thing is if you have a shura, like when you have a field, you always will have to have the base raiva. Rabbi Yossi makes no such difference. And I'm going to point out another nuance of Akasha. And the nuance of Akasha is that if you plant, that was the whole beginning of Halacha Vav, that if you plant a single dalas in a field of vegetables, the Mishnah says, single dalas in a field of grain, you have to have a base raiva. Rabbi Yossi holds over here, you only need to have, by a row, you only have to have 4 amas. I know 4 amas is more than 6 tfachim, but 4 amas is also more lenient. Okay, so it is more lenient. But the point is that based on the Chachamim's knowledge that Rabbi Yossi holds that by Mekayim Kolachim, even a row Lizera, Dinoi is like Yechidim, so they couldn't ask a Kasha on Rabbi Yossi. That for short results. Okay, now where else do we find other Amoraim speaking about the difference of whether you planted vegetables, which is what you normally do, to eat its leaf, which is how we defined it as a yerek, as we learned before, versus even though they are vegetables, but the moment they intend, either by the planting of, or later when you are coming to the harvesting time and you're choosing to be mekayim it in the ground, if it's lizera, yechidim, if it's yechidim, you have to leave a base raiva, the Amar Rabbi Yoina, and Rabbi Yossi Gilila, in the name of Rabbi Yossi ben Chanina. Listen to this line, hamekayim kelach echad. Kelachecha means only one stalk. Now I will say you have a field of grain, and you have in there 1 kelach of a vegetable. So when you put in the vegetable, other vegetables, how much space would you need? 6 tfachim. Now you changed your mind and you want to leave it lizera. So the din is tzarech lahachnis beis roiva oy lasis mechitza gavaya sara tfachim. So that's clearly you see that the whole halacha changes because you're being mekayim et lizera. And now comes the final line on Daf Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis, which is a shocker, that this din of since you are leaving this vegetables for its seed, its status changes. Listen to these words, is afilu min b'minoi. Wow. Which means it's not only in a field of grain. The Gemara is going to right away challenge this. Even if you have min b'minoi, you have 2 vegetables, the same vegetable. And at some point, either from the beginning or at some point later, one of these vegetables are being left in the ground for its seed. Halachically, it's not min b'minoi. How much space do you have to have? Base roiva. So asks the Gemara, but on the last line of Min B'Minoi, Hasiv Rabbi Bun Barchia in front of Rab Ze'era, hold on, he's quoting a Mishnah Mesachtes Maisres. They were learning about the halachas of separating Maiser, that kuzbar coriander. If zera al zera, if it was planted for its seed, then if you have any green part of the coriander and it was not planted for it, the yiraka is exempt, meaning the seeds have to be tithed. Now, what we clearly see over here, what's the connection between this and that, is that seeds themselves are considered edible. Because if the seeds would not be oichel, then they would not be chayver maisres at all. Okay, so now the Gemara, it's amazing, the connection. I'll listen to the logic. So once we have a raya from Mesechtes Maisres, that only Yeraka Pater, which implies that the zera is chayv and maisres, which implies that the zera is considered edible. How can you tell me that if a vegetable is being planted for, or even if it was planted for the vegetable, for the leaf, but now you're being mekayim it l'zera, that it becomes so different from its neighboring vegetable that's min b'minoi, that you have to have a base riva? Why is that so? The zera is edible, so it's an edible vegetable. In other words, the coriander is also, whether you're eating the leaves, whether you didn't plant it for the leaves, that's why it's exempt. But you see that the seed is considered edible. How can it be so different of a species that you have to have a base raiva? That is what they asked in front of Rab Ze'era. So answers Rab Ze'era, Amar Lei, Shani Kuzbar. You don't compare one case to the other. Coriander is unique. Taka, by coriander, since Bimitzias, Shehi v'zara nechalim, both the leaves and the seeds are edible. That's why that kuzbar shezra lezera, only Yeraka Pater, because he didn't even plant it for the Yeraka, but the seeds are chayiv to be tithed. Masha Enkin, what he's implying is when it comes to the seeds of other vegetables, they are considered inedible. And therefore, they're considered such a different species that we have the shita that hamakayim kelach, you have to have a base roiva afilu min b'minoi. Wow. And now let's go back to the opening part of the Mishnah, which later in the Sefer is subject to an argument, and that is one gourd near a field of grain, one gourd near a field of grain. So we have Bein Tanakama, which is the Chacham, and Bein Rabbi Yossi, they hold you have to have a base roiva. But later we went to the road. Let's go back to the first case of the Mishnah. But then we had at the end of the Mishnah two opinions of B'Shem Rabbi Yishmael. One is substantially, all of them are much more than the Tanakama. Right? We said that a base saw is 8 times a base roiva. 8 times. So Rav Meir B'Shem Rabbi Yishmael is 8 times that amount. Rabbi Yossi ben Achoytef Afrasim B'Shem Rabbi Yishmael holds 30 times the amount of 8 times more. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yossi ben Achoytef, Amar Rabbi Yossi ben Abun, Boyurei, come and see, Ma ben Tchilas Rabbi Yishmael l'soifai. Look how much Rabbi Yishmael changed his mind. As we mentioned, this machlekes is not that we lost the Mesorah of what Rabbi Yishmael said. That's a given by the Gemara. That Rabbi Meir heard it from Rabbi Yishmael, that it's the base sashir. And then, and Rabbi Yossi ben Achoytef, he heard B'Shem Rabbi Yishmael. He got that tradition. Rabbi Yishmael said later, base kur. Wow. So what did Rabbi Yishmael say? He changed his mind. Now there's a change and there's a change. You know, there's a change when you go from 6 tvachim to 4 amas. I get that. But here we're speaking about an unbelievable change. So ma ben tchilas Rabbi Yishmael l'soifon. Shetchilasoi, that's the premise of the Gemara. There was Rabbi Meir's tradition that he had. B'Shem Rabbi Yishmael was bebeis sah. Then when later Rabbi Yossi ben Achoytef v'soyte bebeis kur. So go see ma ben tchilas l'soifon. What is the Gemara trying to say? I'm giving a suggestion, and this is a theme that we quoted in the name of the Rebbe Bechlal when it comes to arguments between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, that Rabbi Akiva represents the Baal Tshuva as he was a Baal Tshuva, and Rabbi Yishmael represents the avodah of a tzaddik. And one of the normal differences between a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva is by a tzaddik, you have the avodah of Yelchu Machayel al Choyel. In other words, he's not running away from evil. So everything is it's an organized avodah. So let me apply it over here. So when you change your mind, you go up a step. You don't make a drastic change. Drastic change, that is dafka connected theoretically to the avoid of a balshuva. Because you have this urgency of running away from where you are. Right? In other words, even change from a tzaddik is much slower paced than the change of a balshuva. That in one instant, a person can go from a rasha to a tzaddik. That is how things should be. And since Rabbi Yishmael is connected to the avodah of a tzaddik, even if Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yishmael, like everyone else, you grow, you evolve in a good way, and you change your opinion, but your change won't be so dramatic. But here's an exception. So that's the boyur a. We have the whole idea. The Zohar says that in the future, Asad Mashiach li'isava tzadikaya b'tiyufta. And how many Memari Hasidus do we have on that? That one of the great aspects of Mashiach is that he's going to teach the tzaddik to do the avodah of a Baal Tshuva. And how is that even possible? That's not the point. I'm not the beer, just a fact. So that's the chiddush, that even Rabbi Yishmael, how much he changed his opinion from his original opinion. In other words, the level of growth that ultimately will be experienced even by the tzaddik will be humongous. Won't only be the yelchom achayil al chayil, right? But it will be the avoid of jumping, the avoid of running. Ma ben chilas Rabbi Yishmael l'soifer, beautiful. On that we say hadron aloch aruga. We're coming back to Perek Aruga, and it's not only a new daf, but God willing, tomorrow we're beginning the whole new topic. Right? We concluded the topic of Kilei Zerayim, and now with the help of Hashem, tomorrow we are starting the topic of Kilai HaKerem.
I think I'm ready for a new topic.
Oh, I know. I'm missing.
I'd like to review it one more time.
Okay.
Well,
don't worry. I promise you the Gemara